From Connecticut Public Radio in Hartford, this is Audacious. I'm Kyone Wolfe. Here's a question for you. If you could learn all of your family secrets, do you really think you'd want to? For some of us, the answer is totally yes. Maybe those secrets would explain a few things, like a strange tension you've always felt, but you could never quite understand. But then there are the secrets you wish you could just shove right back into Pandora's box. The ones that, once you know, you're stuck with. No takebacks. And then there's this third category, the tricky ones. The ones where you think, I could have lived my whole life not knowing this, but now that I do know, I can't ignore it, and I have to figure out what it means, or how to incorporate this new reality into the context of my life. Today, we're talking about the kind of family secrets that change everything for everybody involved. You'll hear from a woman who, at just 14 years old, found out that the man she called Dad was not her biological father. But first, let me introduce you to Michael Hainey. He wrote a memoir called After Visiting Friends, A Son's Story. When Michael was just 6 years old, his mom answered a knock on the front door. Standing there was her brother-in-law, delivering the kind of news that stops the whole world in its tracks. Her husband, Michael's dad, was dead. I asked Michael to rewind a little bit and tell me his earliest memory of his father.
I think my memories begin the day my father died. And, that might sound exaggerated to some people, but I had just turned 6. And if you sort of know anything about childhood development, sort of like when your life locks in is around that time. I have scant memories of him, but if you ask me, what did his voice sound like or what was he like? I really, there's sort of like images that float in my mind, but, it was the morning that my uncle came over and told my mother and my brother and me that he had died overnight. And that's kind of where my memories of my father begin.
Will you tell me what you remember from that day that your uncle came over and said that your father had died?
My father was a newspaper man in Chicago, and he worked what was called the overnight shift, the lobster shift from 6 p.m. till 2 a.m. So he would work late, and then he oftentimes would wait up to have breakfast with us, and then he'd go to bed. I was in kindergarten at the time. My brother was in second grade, and she came to wake us up that morning. And as she was waking us up, the doorbell rang. This is about 6:30 or so in the morning. She went downstairs, and the next thing my brother and I heard was her crying. And we sort of tiptoed down the stairs. My uncle was standing there, and he had told her that my father had gotten off of work and that he had, on the way to his car, apparently had a heart attack and collapsed in the street, and some police found him. And then the police called my uncle, and that's how he came to tell us the news.
How long until you wanted more information and went after it?
When I was a kid growing up, 7, 8 years old, I was watching TV, and, you'd watch these shows and you'd always see the police would come and tell you something bad happened to someone. And I remember asking my mother, like, how come Uncle Dick came and told us that morning that Dad had died, if he had died in the street and the police found him? And she said, I don't know. I guess it's just the way it went, and it just always sort of stuck with me that something didn't add up. And when I finally got a little older and I was in high school, when I was probably around 16, I went to the library and I wanted to see if any obituaries had been written about my father since he had been a newspaper man, and if the newspapers had covered it, and they had. And there were 5 papers, and they all wrote an obituary, but 2 of them had an error in them, or what I later learned was an error, that it said he had died after visiting friends, and it gave an address, a street in Chicago where he had died. And I thought, well, that's weird. We don't know anyone there. And if there were any friends, how come no one's ever come up to me and said, gee, I was with your father the night he died? So I had that when I was about 17, and then I just sat with it for a good 20 years. And it wasn't until I was 35, 36, which was when I turned 36, and my father died at 35. And so when I essentially outlived him, I decided I needed to sort of figure out what had happened and go in search of that secret.
I wonder, as you were seeking out the truth, how you balanced being a journalist
and being a son, that sort of tension between wanting the truth, but also knowing that the truth was quite personal.
Everyone says they want the truth, but you realize no one wants to be the truth teller because we seem to know what happens. Those people don't have good outcomes usually. So I guess I kind of compartmentalized it while I was searching for the answers. I was in reporter mind, and I would try and track this down and approach it as I would any story I was working on, trying to find leads and contacts and people who, and then, I was dealing with something that happened 30, 40 years ago. And, I told my mother and my brother what I was working on, and they were supportive, but I didn't really sort of like loop them in a lot unless I was asking for my mother to maybe recommend someone I could talk to. But the tension came as I did land on the truth, and then knowing this truth of what happened to my father / my mother's husband, I had to sit with that.
Why do you say it like that? My father / my mother's husband.
Well, like there's what I want to know as a son. And yet, as you say in your question, then there's a family, right? And this is a family secret. It's not just me going in search of my father, but it's what happened to him. But it's also, I had a choice to sit with that and keep it to myself, or since I had decided I want to write about this, I'm going to have to share this at some point. And to say it did cause me a tremendous, once I learned the truth, there was about a solid year where I just sat with that truth and that knowledge. And I thought, I can't write this book. I can't, because I can't go to my mother and tell her what I found out about him. I had fears that I would upset her. I had fears that she'd cast me out. And like I'd already lost one parent. By telling her this, would I lose my second parent? Yeah. And it was finally my wife who said, if she's like many women, she probably already knows something was wrong, and you should just talk to her about it. So I kind of worked up the courage to open a discussion with her, and that's where we went.
So how did you find out the truth?
The people who knew the truth were these colleagues of my father who we'd worked with in the paper. And here I was coming 30, 40 years later, and I kind of soon realized they were all stonewalling me. None of them was telling me the truth. And one of them even, they'd say, well, I don't know anything about that night. And I'd say, let me get this straight. You're a newspaper reporter. You're a guy whose whole life has been finding stories and having a hunch for stories. And you're telling me when I show you this obituary with this weird discrepancy, like, no, never seen that before. Don't know anything about it. I had people who just shut me down across the whole way. And yet I had these two, I can only say spectacular interventions that happened. One was I couldn't find the exact address of where he died. And so finally I went to the morgue in Chicago, and this woman running the morgue said, you got to go to the hospital. They'll have a record. I went to the hospital. I asked for the records. I met this woman. She said, I don't see a record here. 2 years later, I come home one day and there's an envelope. And it's a note from this woman who had been at the hospital, and she said, I couldn't stop thinking about you. And the other day, I opened up all those file cabinets. I wanted to go through them again and look, and I found nothing. But then when I was putting them back, I saw something at the bottom of the file cabinet, and it was your father's record. It had fallen out. So she sent me that record, and it had the exact address. It had the name of the person whose apartment he died in. So I had a tangible lead. I looked up the name of that person immediately, and they, lo and behold, had died maybe a year prior. So I had lost that thread. I then got a call maybe a year later from a guy who had worked with my father, but I never knew about. And he calls me up and he says, I hear you've been calling around about your father. His name is Tom Moffat. And he said, I'm going to tell you what happened to your father. And the reason I'm going to tell you what happened to your father is because when I was a boy growing up in the 50s, he said, my mother, quote unquote, went away and she never came back. And it was only decades later that I found out she'd had a nervous breakdown and had to go into an institution. And he said, and lo and behold, years later, I had a nervous breakdown. And I wonder, like, maybe if someone had told me, if we talked about it, if we'd been open about it, who knows? And so he called me and he said, here's what happened. He said, I was your father's alibi. he had been seeing a woman, a young woman that he worked with, and he said, your father had a stroke while he was in her apartment after work, probably in bed. And she called the police and called the ambulance. And in the meantime, she also called your uncle, who was also a prominent newspaper editor in Chicago. So my uncle shows up 3, 4 in the morning. And I should state here, my uncle had passed as well before I started working on this, so I never was able to interview him. But my uncle, and this is a period in time when these things still happened, late 60s, early 70s, he said to the police, listen, he's got a wife and 2 kids at home. How about I break it to him? They said, sure. So my uncle, in the, I think, misguided hope that he was protecting us from a tragedy and an awful reality, in essence, covered it up, but in essence also created a mystery that even a young boy, me, at the time, like, that doesn't square. Something's off here. And I think it's also that sense of, I say, if you sense something is off, something is off.
Yep.
And it's up to you to go in search of the answers. But as I say, like, proceed with love. When you read my book, people say, well, weren't you angry at those people who lied to you? I said, no. I said, I get it. If there was a knock on your door tomorrow, we all do the psychological, emotional calculus of like, is this person ready for it? Do I want to be the one to tell them? And so, I don't hold it against anyone. Any people say, well, what do you think of your father when you find out how he died? And I think, it makes me sad what happened, but I don't hate him for it. 5 minutes either way, he could have died in a very different situation and it would have been a different story. But here we are.
That was Michael Hainey. He's the author of the memoir, After Visiting Friends, A Son's Story. When we get back, find out how Michael's mom reacted and hear his perspective on people who hide the truth.
I wish people could get release from being the secret keepers, because being a secret keeper forces you to maintain a distance. You're imposing some kind of exile on yourself because you can't get too close to people because you're always afraid they're going to ask a question.
Plus, how one woman found out that her dad was not her biological father.
I think for a long time I grieved losing that biological connection. Honestly, I still grieve that loss.
I'm Kyone Wolf. This is Audacious. Stay with me. This is Audacious. I'm Kyone Wolf, and today we're hearing stories from people who discovered shocking family secrets. In a little bit, you're going to hear from a woman who, as a teenager, stumbled upon a truth that reshaped her entire understanding of her family and herself. A secret about her father that had been hidden from her whole life. But before we get to her story, imagine this. You've been told one story your whole life, but something about it just doesn't sit right. And you can't stop wondering what really happened. For Michael Hainey, that question starts with a knock on the door. And from there, he takes us through a decades-long search to uncover the truth about his father's death. Back to our conversation.
At some point, you made the decision to tell your mother?
Mm-hmm.
Will you talk about what went into that decision?
I decided to tell my mother because I thought, I want to write this book and I want to be truthful and present and, let her know what I had discovered. And so I was also very aware, she had her own pain and grief. And I should put also this all in the context of, this was 1970 when he died. And it was this moment also before grief counseling or any of this stuff. And I never had counseling. We never had family counseling. We just went on. So I was walking also into a context of coming to her decades later and saying, hey, that thing I've been looking into, I want to talk to you about it. And so I said, we went out to dinner and I said, with as much kindness and protection as I could around it, I said, I've been I found out what happened to Dad when he died. And did you ever know this person? Her name was Bobby Hess. She said, no. I said, well, that's where he died, in her apartment. And from what it seems like, they were having an affair. And, she sat with that for a while. And then she said, oh, is she alive? And I told her, no, she had died. And she just, my mother's the epitome of a stoic, unemotional person. And she just said, well, I guess I could see some of that now. And I said, well, I don't know if he was happy. He was always, the job was very hard on him, and he put a lot of stress. And, she said it was a hard place to be in our lives. He worked all night, slept all day. I'd see him for 2-3 hours, and then he was gone. It was a very strange relationship. But we ended the dinner, and she said, but I just want you to know that he loved you and your brother more than anyone, anything, and anyone in the world. And you should know that. And I said, thanks. And then she said, but I just feel like maybe things were hard for him. And she had a lot of compassion for it. But I think what was really striking to me was the days after it and the weeks after, because when I'd finished a draft of the book, I gave it to her. And she called me one day and she said, it's the most beautiful gift you ever could have given me, because it's answered questions that I had buried for so long and things I had wondered about. But here, 40 years later, you've given me knowledge here. And she said, for instance, I know this is going to sound strange, but I was just remembering now, 6 or 8 months before he died, I was doing the wash downstairs in the basement, and I went to put some of his shirts in the laundry, and in one of them I picked up, she said, it sounds like it's out of a movie, but there was lipstick on his collar. And she said, I'd forgotten all that for all these years. And I said, well, what did you do? She said, I put it in the machine and I closed the lid and I pushed it down. And I said, you didn't do anything? She said, Michael, I was a mother. I was 33 years old. I was living in the suburbs. I'd given up my career at the newspaper. I had 2 boys at home under the age of 6, 8. To contemplate that reality, I couldn't do it. But she said, now I see how I'd pushed so many things down. So the book opened up avenues of conversation that we had never had 40, 50 years earlier. And I think that's between my mother and my brother and myself. So it's been one very positive of it.
When I hear you talk, I think about how freeing it is to finally know the truth. When you suspect something's off, you really think you're going crazy, and it can affect everything in your life, mentally, physically, socially, everything about you. Your body can twist to try to make sense of what this difference is, this gap between what you are sensing and what you know, which is unknown. So when I hear this, it feels like an incredible relief, this whole story. And I wonder, when you think about family secrets, on the one hand, it makes sense why not everything is everybody's business. There are stories in my family that I know I wish I didn't know. And I'm pretty sure there are stories that I only know a little bit about or nothing at all. And in a way, I'm grateful that I don't know.
I feel protected by my ignorance. So I'd like your thoughts on why you think family secrets exist. Is there such thing as a good family secret? What are your reflections on that?
That's the crux of all of this, really, because I think, why do family secrets exist? Let's look at my story, and I think it has elements of many of the reasons, which is the desire of someone in the family to protect people. What are they trying to protect you from? Something that is shameful, something that they think is bad, shameful, or that the people who are in the blast radius can't handle. And let's try and save them from this knowledge. And that's probably done out of love, some sense of love, right? Sometimes it's individuals trying to do it to protect other people, and sometimes it's self-imposed as well. I think that happens in a lot of families where some individual suffers something shameful or destructive. Did I bring this on myself, or did I do it myself? And then you withdraw. and you build your own kind of wall around the secret. It's often so misguided. And I think what is on the other side of it, and again, I think I say it's not like we can all just go forth wielding the book of truth as we go on our journey and say, please tell me the truth and all will bow down before you. It's really, but I think so many people in families are probably aching to be relieved of their secret. And that doesn't mean they need to share it with us, the people involved in it, but I think that's what I wish for people. It's like, 'cause to carry a secret, as you said so beautifully, it's that sense of the body carries the trauma. Not just the body, but I mean, I think of myself as a 6, 7, 8-year-old boy and like the narratives I would create. And when I look back, people say, oh, come on, really? How could you? Why wouldn't I know that? Why wouldn't I have figured something out? And yet you can't square it. And then you see everything through this refracted, cracked prism, and you sort of try and adjust your life to it. And people say, as I said, like, well, now that you know the truth, what do you think? I said, it's fine. It wasn't even that big a deal. In the scheme of things, it's sad, but now I know. Now I know I wasn't sort of like, quote unquote, crazy or wrong for suspecting something. And I think I wish people could get release from being the secret keepers, because being a secret keeper forces you to maintain a distance. You're imposing some kind of exile on yourself because you can't get too close to people because you're always afraid they're going to ask a question. I mean, a perfect example, as I said, my uncle who died years before I thought when I went to his son, my cousin, and I called my cousin and I said, I have a question for you. And he literally said, I always knew this day was going to come. I said, what are you talking about? He said, my uncle said to me, Michael's going to figure it out one day. I could see it in his eyes. He knows something. And he said, when you were a teenager and you'd come around, he was always so afraid you were going to ask him something. And so these secrets create these distances, like, and then it's the radius that comes out from it. It's like, how come Michael's so aloof from everyone? What's with that guy? Well, you're carrying this burden, and it messes up families for generations.
It's so hard too, because when I think about like what would be an appropriate family secret to keep, it gets complicated right away. Like if the person is dead and they can't explain themselves, if the person who's going to find out about the secret is generations off, what's the point? If it's about you, but it's not really about you, like if it's just a shameful thing that there's nothing to be done about it anymore. I'd love to hear your thoughts on when you think it's okay to keep a family secret.
I guess maybe the only time it's okay for someone to keep the truth if it's their life and someone comes to you and says, tell me about yourself. What's going on? I don't want to talk about it. I think that's sad and it's unfortunate because, again, they're probably suffering with that secret, and the suffering of the secret is silence and solitude and isolation oftentimes, and then that leads, I'm sure, to depression and someone having to be someone they're not. I mean, look at secrets decades ago with one's sexual identity, right? That's a secret. That's a family secret. Like I have to live in silence in a quote unquote closet because I can't be this because my family will push me out. So that is a secret that I suffer with at that time. Fortunately, we've been able to say that there's openness to let go of that secret. But, that's, I think, an example of one level of how those secrets have such deep ramifications if they're forced to be contained.
It sounds to me like you're saying that overall, there really is no advantage to keeping secrets.
I think in the biggest sense, truth should come out. People need to prepare other people for the truth as well as they can. And I also think that doesn't mean you should just go, hey, here's something you should know. Because we've also read the stories, people are like, why did you tell me that? I didn't need to know that. I never asked to know that. I was fine before you told me that. And you come along and decide, you need to tell me everything you've just learned about my mother. Like, I was fine. Well, I just thought you should know. Well, who appointed you?
With this book, do you feel like this is behind you?
The point of life is not closure, it's openness. What I had back then was everything was closed off. There was closure. It was a false closure. And, what we hope for in life is that we can open up doors and keep moving through them down the long hallway of life. So I think I've got openness now, and in that openness taught me these things are scary to go in search of sometimes, but you really have no idea, like those unseen hands that will rise up to meet you and help you that you have no idea are out there once you sort of go forward and want to, with a good heart and try and get some openness for yourself.
Well, Michael Hainey, thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for creating the conversations that you create. I think they inspire a lot of people, so thank you.
How do you process discovering a huge family secret when you're barely old enough to drive? When Melissa Daniels was 7 years old, the man who she thought was her biological father died. At 14, she found out that truth, and that her mom used a donor. She'll tell the story of what it was like meeting that donor, as well as some of her 10 half-siblings. So, how did she find out?
My mom and I were having like this argument, and I was like, well, you're not my mom anyways, like trying to, I don't know. It doesn't make sense. It's not true. DNA proves she's definitely my mom. And she was like, well, your dad's not your dad. And I was like, floored.
Wait a minute. So you were bluffing. You were just feeling your feelings as a teenager, and you said, you're not my real mom. And she's like, oh, yeah?
Yeah. That was her clapback. And I was just like stunned. I think my dad passed away when I was 7 from cancer. And so we had like this sit down talk, like, when he knew what was going on and everything. And I vaguely remember him talking about like how hard they had to try to have me, but I was 7 and I didn't put pieces together and that wasn't like my main takeaway from that.
And so you're just sitting with this for 7 years, and are you bringing it up to her more?
Well, I did ask questions after that, and that's when she was like, we had to use a donor. He had a vasectomy after his first marriage, so they had to use a donor. And she said she didn't keep any of the paperwork or information, and so I didn't really have anywhere to go or any way to find anything out. And I could not foresee DNA tests becoming available in the future. That was just out there. So I was just thinking I would never find anything.
And how was that for you? Did you find peace and acceptance with the idea that you would never know who your biological father was, or did it always sort of insert itself in the operating system of your existence and identity?
I just kind of accepted for a long time that, I wouldn't really know. And I kind of wanted to have a little bit of denial, because I think the hardest part for me was realizing that I didn't have that biological connection to my dad, because like a lot of times when you lose someone like close to you, like a parent or I don't want to say child, I can't imagine that. I don't want to put down there, but it's like, they'll always be a part of you, because they made you. They're in the nucleus of every cell that is you. And so I think I kind of found comfort in that. And so I think for a long time I grieved losing that biological connection. Honestly, I still grieve that loss. So I think that was the hardest part. I had a lot of negative feelings about it for a long time.
So then in 2015, you find 23andMe online DNA testing, and you do the thing, and the results are interesting, but there aren't really any connections. What did you do next?
I just kind of let it sit for a few years, and I want to say it was 2017. So fast forward 2 years, I get a message, and I don't know what it is with this, but it always happens like late at night, and then I just can't sleep. And it's this young lady, just a year younger than me, And she's like, hey, I think we're half sisters. And I was like, oh, hold on, I need to check this. And find out, yeah, she confirms they're donor conceived. And she's like, oh, I have another sister can, see with the same donor. So it was like a 2-for-1. And so now I'm like looking everybody up online, like, what's your Facebook? What do you look like? What is this? And they had known their whole life that they were donor conceived. They were very like upfront with them about it. And I think they're better for it. But their parents kept the paperwork. So it was the first time I was able to see, the donor's profile, get the donor number and the clinic information. Unfortunately, the clinic had closed down in 2011. So, I mean, they aren't very good about keeping records because they aren't legally really obligated to. I probably wouldn't have had luck even if they were open, but, so that was that. And I was like, well, this is really exciting. I found a group for donor conceived people online. We are donor conceived. Joined that and found out that I should be on Ancestry too, because they have different databases. So you get different matches depending on which one you're on. And so if you're looking for family, it's worth being on both. And so I was like, okay, well, I guess I'm going to take an Ancestry test. And I get my results. And the first match I see is a parent-child match. And I was like, floored. I was like, what? Like, is this for real right now? And turns out he had been on Ancestry for a few years, ironically, to find out more information about his birth father.
Because
he's
he
an
was
adoptee.
adopted.
Mm-hmm.
Wait. So you wrote him?
I did. It took me a long time to figure out like a message because I figured I didn't know why he was on there. I didn't know he was adopted. So I was thinking that maybe he wanted to be found. And I was also kind of shocked because this sort of all happened in like about a 2-month span, so I went from thinking like just feeling defeated, like I'm not going to find anything. Oh, well, to finding 2 half sisters and now a biological parent match. That's not my mom.
And your half sisters hadn't yet met him, right? Or connected with him?
No, hadn't met him, hadn't tested on Ancestry. So I was the first one to test on Ancestry and match with him and reach out.
So you unlocked that door.
I did. I did. And like, so I was super worried about contacting him because I didn't want to like say the wrong thing. He was a stranger to me. I don't know anything about this man or what he's like or how he's going to receive this information. And I sort of just sent him a message thanking him for, being a donor and giving my parents the ability to have me. And, just saying like, I would just like to thank you and get some health information, just very basic stuff. A few days go by and I don't hear back from him. And I'm like, maybe he doesn't want to talk to us. He's not here to connect with us. But I also was like, okay, if you're not going to let me know you, you're going to know me. And so I sent him a message sort of telling him about me and also stating that, I wasn't looking for any money because I didn't say that the first one. And I was like, what's going on? And I ended up getting an email and it was like a photo of him and his wife. And, he kind of explained that he wanted to sit down and talk to his wife about it first, which is understandable. And I had really low expectations going into this. So I feel like just the fact that like he sent me the email, I was like open to communicate was more than I ever anticipated. Like I had no expectations for a long time. I didn't think I would ever have any idea who this person was. So having a name and a face was really nice.
So you keep in touch, you're kind of getting to know each other through text and, every day or so you're texting and communicating and eventually you decide to meet up and a camera crew followed you, which is so cool to see. What was it like when you and your half-sisters saw him and met him for the first time?
Hi! Welcome. Thanks for coming out.
Thank you. How do you feel about everything? Is it weird? I bet. We think it's a little weird too, so you're not alone.
It was wild, because there's all these little mannerisms that people have, and it's got to be genetic, because we weren't raised together, didn't grow up together, but we have these little things. And I remember one of my sisters, like, she gets like whenever she gets excited or nervous, like the pitch of her voice will go up a little bit. And I was just like, oh my gosh, you sound like me. Like, and then we could kind of see like how we're double jointed and like just seeing all the different things that we have in common. And then also things that are unique. And there was a strange familiarity to it. Like we're all familiar, but in any other situation or under other circumstances, like it wouldn't be familiar, if there wasn't.
Like if you happen to see this dude at a bar or
Right.
something, you wouldn't be like, that's you're my father, right?
Right. Yeah, it was a powerful experience. And it's been great just to continue to connect with him because I still keep in touch with him. We've had more siblings pop up.
How many now?
There are 9 of us that we know of. There's one more out there, but so her parents posted about her on the donor sibling registry, but they were very explicit in that they didn't want her to know, but they just wanted to see pictures. And we reached out, haven't heard back. So she's out there. She'd be the oldest one too, but we don't know. We call her Sistery.
Sistery?
Yeah, because she's a sister. That's a mystery.
So there's a love of wordplay in your family, I see.
Yeah. So 10 if you count her, and then Ted has his own 3 kids, the chosen ones. So that would put us at 13. But yeah, and I feel like for the siblings who found out like at some point growing up, it seems like it's been easier for us to connect. We've recently started getting siblings that found out through a DNA test. And so I think it's kind of a bit more difficult for them to open up and adjust. And it's like opening Pandora's box, and it can rock someone's world. And so even though I'm not glad about how and when I found out, and I'm glad I also didn't find out that way.
That was Melissa Daniels. She's telling the story of what happened after she found out that her biological father was not the man she grew up calling Dad. After the break, how does she feel about the way she learned the truth?
I would have rather found out as a child, even before 7, or at least if it was 7, for it to have been like an ongoing conversation. So it was sort of like something that was incorporated into my story, and that way it wouldn't really be a big thing.
I'm Kyone Wolf. This is Audacious. Stay tuned. This is Audacious. I'm Kyone Wolf. When Melissa Daniels was 7, her dad died. But at 14 years old, Melissa learned something that turned her world upside down. The man she grieved wasn't her biological dad. Her biological father was a sperm donor. And suddenly everything Melissa thought she knew about her family, about herself, shifted. Being a teenage girl is confusing enough, so when does Melissa think she should have found out?
I would have rather found out as a child, even before 7, or at least if it was 7, for it to have been like an ongoing conversation. So it was sort of like something that was incorporated into my story, and that way it wouldn't really be a big thing, because it was made a big thing in the manner in which it was disclosed to me, and then the fact that nobody would answer my questions.
Because you now know that in a way you were lied to, right? Something was kept from you, from the people in your life whom you trusted more than anyone, and you were right to trust them because they're your parents. Do you think it being revealed that you had been lied to for so long, and maybe that's a strong word, but I don't know another word for it, that affected how you trust the world?
That's a difficult question. I think that's had some effects with regards to my other relationships and what I have tolerated from other people. But I think I'm still pretty optimistic despite that. And knowing better enables us to do better. And so that's why I think it's important for surrogacy people to talk about their experiences. And that's why I appreciate you doing this, so people can know better and do better, ideally, because I feel like honesty is the best policy.
So specifically, you'd like the ears hearing your voice and your story to be not only people who are donor conceived and are figuring this out, whether they've known their whole lives or they just found out because of a DNA test and their whole life just blew open, but also the people who are donating themselves to the cause of making more human beings, to talk about it differently.
Yeah, and a big problem is the lack of regulation with the industry as a whole. And just with egg donors and sperm donors in general, there's still clinics who, sell the idea of anonymity. And it's like Ancestry, 23andMe are well known. Like, how dare you still tell these potential prospective donors and the recipients that, anonymity is a thing? Like, how dare you? And it's like that should be a red flag in and of itself to me. If you're still trying to tell these people that they can remain anonymous, what else are you being deceptive about?
Because all it takes is one family member. When I did Ancestry.com, it occurred to me only much later that I had just put my brothers on the map.
Yeah.
I had just put my parents on the map, etc. And that I did that. And so now they are all to some degree discoverable for whatever that's worth.
Yeah. And so it's funny that you mentioned that, because during the time I was waiting for my Ancestry results, I was I paid for an Ancestry membership. I was using my DNA matches from 23andMe and another site I uploaded to build a tree. And it's forensic genealogy. It's what they are using now to identify people in cold cases or Jane and John Doe's, like the Golden State Killer. And so they'll use these matches to try and triangulate the person they're looking for. And I had this huge tree, and I had his birth mother on my tree, but I didn't make the connection to him, obviously, because he's adopted. So there is not that connection. So I would not have been able to find him through those means if he had not taken a DNA test.
I want to go back a little bit to your dad. And when you found out, you've said, I didn't want to be donor conceived. I wanted my dad to be my dad.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to hear more about that.
I've always felt really close to my dad, and I still do. He's always going to be my dad. That's not going to change. And like I said, I kind of clung on to this idea that I had this biological connection to him. And so it felt like losing him all over again, to be honest, because losing a parent as a child is hard enough as it is. And once you kind of get to a place where you're like, okay, this is my life, this is going through the things. And then to find that out, it just kind of opened the wound again. And I think that was another big factor in my negative feelings about being donor conceived for a long time. I don't feel so negatively about it now. I actually have a lot of gratitude, but I think a big part of that is, one, having the answers, and then two, having a good outcome. My biological father ended up being a jerk or crazy or dead. I feel a lot better about it. I'll always mourn the fact that I don't have that biological connection with my dad, but it's helped me make peace with it. And I think that he wanted me to know, and he would be happy for me. So I just find comfort in that now.
For people who just got the news that they were donor conceived and they have a lot on their mind right now, and they aren't sure whether they should open more Pandora's boxes, if they should just put their fingers in their ears and say la 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 la. Oh my gosh, what do you think is good advice for people you don't know, and you don't know what their lives are like, but what do you think is good advice upon getting this news that they're donor conceived?
Give yourself a moment, take a breath, give yourself the space, understand that there are ups and downs. And I'm saying this as someone who didn't find out through a DNA test, so I'm only trying to imagine what that must be like. But you don't want to do anything rash. And even if you don't find out via DNA test, there are ups and downs, right? So there's the shock of finding out that what you thought you knew about yourself isn't true. because it seems like such a fundamental thing. I figure most people know to some extent the identity of their biological parent. And so to have that sort of taken away, especially when you were secure in what you thought you knew to be true, can be really upsetting. And hopefully the parent wants to come clean and will be honest and sympathetic to the situation that you find yourself in, or supportive in their feelings and let them feel their feelings, whatever they may be. I think it's hard too for a lot of older surrogacy people, or like millennials and on, because a lot of our parents, like, they were not informed that they should be open or disclose. In fact, some parents are told that they shouldn't tell their kids. They'll never know. And once you get to the point, like, now they're like, oh, I see DNA tests like coming out. Like, I don't want to tell them. This ship has sailed. Like, we're just going to sort of sit here and cross our fingers. And so I think a lot of times there wasn't bad intent. They weren't trying to emotionally harm and deceive their child. They just weren't informed. They didn't have the knowledge or toolbox to approach the situation with their kids.
They didn't know any better, so they couldn't do any better.
Yeah. But I think we're making progress now. I think a lot more people are starting to see that, okay, we should disclose this to our kids. I mean, there's still some people who don't. And I think a lot of it too is the shame that a lot of parents have felt that come from society about having to go through infertility treatments or having to use a donor. And so I think that might play a part in it too. But by using that to justify keeping it from your kid is sort of, burdening them with your shame and your trauma. And not saying that it's not valid, those feelings are valid, but it's not fair for you to impose these negative consequences on your kid because of these feelings. Like, it's at that point that you need to try and get more information and work those things out with yourself so you can be the best version of yourself for yourself and your child.
Well, Melissa Daniels, thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you so much.
Audacious is always lovingly produced by Jessica Severin de Martinez, Khalil Rahman, Meg Fitzgerald, Robin Doyon Aitken, and Meg Dalton at Connecticut Public Radio in Hartford. If you like this episode, you'll want to check out another one we did about 2 women who found out they were donor conceived. But that's not the shocking part. The real twist for one of them? Her biological father wasn't the donor her parents chose. It was the fertility doctor who helped conceive her. It's called fertility fraud. And in most states, including Connecticut, it's not illegal for fertility doctors to do this. We also have an episode we love about forgiveness. Turns out forgiveness is one of those words that seems to mean something completely different to everyone. In that episode, we hear from some of our listeners, a pastor, a poet, philosopher, and a man whose journey toward forgiveness began after a drunk driver's actions left him needing a full face transplant. Both episodes explore the surprising, messy complexities of being human, just like this one. Give them a listen at ctpublic.org/audacious and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss an episode. Stay in touch with me on the socials at Kyone Wolf. And you can always send an email to audacious@ctpublic.org. Thanks for listening.